Well, welcome to the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center's Fall Climate Academy's webinar on New Jersey's Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report. My name's Marjorie Kaplan, and I'm both Associate Director of the Rutgers Climate Institute, and along with my colleague Jean Herb of the Edward Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, I co-direct the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. A few logistics. Today's webinar will last until 1:15. Other than today's presenters and our Rutgers team, you're all muted. So to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. And to find the chat box, look at the bottom of the screen and you'll see a little bubble that says chat. And if you click on that, you can send us questions and comments. Please send your notes to all panelists, as that ensures all of us working behind the scenes today will see your questions. Thanks to my colleagues Matt Drews and Dr. Carrie Ferraro here at Rutgers for their help with today's webinar. We welcome your thoughts and questions. I also want to let you know we're recording today's webinar and it will be available on the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center website, which we'll put into the chat box in a minute. One continuing education credit is available through the Association of State Floodplain Management, and 1.25 certification maintenance credits are available through the American Planning Association. Reach out to us after the webinar if you need a certificate. We're very pleased to have three wonderful colleagues from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection joining us today. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speakers first. First, we'll hear from Paul Orlando, Director of the DEP's Division of Climate, Energy, and Radiation Protection. In addition to authoring the Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report, Paul's division is responsible for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program in New Jersey. New Jersey's greenhouse gas inventory and sustainability programs. His group is also responsible for regulating radiation in medical and industrial applications and administering the state's radiological emergency response plan. He is by training a chemical engineer and a graduate of Rutgers University. Following Paul, we'll hear from Robert Ketting, Assistant Director for Climate Change, Clean Energy, and Sustainability at NJDEP. During his 29-year career with the department, Bob has previously managed the Bureau of Energy and Sustainability and the Air Permitting Program. Bob served as DEP staff representative to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, working on the program development during New Jersey's initial participation in RGGI, and he has worked in the Bureau of Technical Services, where he supervised continuous emission monitoring and stack compliance testing throughout the state of New Jersey. Bob will address key sectors in the 80 by 50 report, including transportation, buildings, and electrification. After Bob, Helaine Barr, an environmental planner and scientist who supervises the climate change program in the Bureau of Climate Change and Clean Energy, will present. Helaine plays a key role supporting New Jersey's re-entry into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, in development of the RGGI Strategic Funding Plan, is a lead author of the report we are being briefed on today, and in overseeing New Jersey's greenhouse gas inventory. I'd like to remind everyone again to put your questions in the chat box to all panelists. It's now my pleasure to invite Paul Orlando to turn on his camera and microphone and take it away.
Thank you, Marjorie. And I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. I also want to take this moment to thank Rutgers and the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center for hosting us and giving us the opportunity to share with you the contents of our Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report. Before I introduce the components of the 80 by 50 report, I would like to review both historical and current climate initiatives that have led to its creation. Previous climate initiatives include the formation of a carbon trading program in 2005 known as RGGI, or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. In 2007, legislators penned the Global Warming Response Act, which mandates reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, establishing both 2020 and 2050 goals. In his first month in office, Governor Philip Murphy issued several executive orders focused on climate. He ordered New Jersey to re-enter RGGI after leaving in 2012 under former Governor Chris Christie. Governor Murphy further ordered that New Jersey should procure 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. He directed New Jersey to participate in the U.S. Climate Alliance of States, to pursue common climate initiatives in the absence of federal leadership, and he directed state agencies to incorporate environmental justice principles in carrying out their statutory and regulatory responsibilities. In June 2019, Governor Murphy amended the Global Warming Response Act and set new deadlines for various milestones, including the issuance of the 80 by 50 report, which we are here to talk to you about today. The first Global Warming Response Act target required the state to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels or below by 2020. New Jersey has exceeded this goal by more than 20 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, largely due to retirement of coal-fired electric generating units and transition to clean
Paul,
natural gas.
can I just interrupt you? I think you
Sure.
want to show your slides.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Right?
One more button. It's not the right slide. Not seeing the.
Matt, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, Paul, you have two monitors, right?
Yes.
Just hit display settings and hit switch.
Display settings in my Word, or
Did you just stop sharing it on?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, let me try again, see if I can. For some reason, the screen that shows there we go. Let's try. No, that's not it. That's it. Okay.
If you click on display settings up there in PowerPoint, it should be able to flip your views. So click. So, Paul, in PowerPoint there, see where it says display settings? Towards the upper left. Click on that. Then hit swap presenter, and there we go.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Now I got to get my notes back here. Okay, all right. Are we good?
Good to go.
Okay, I think this is where we left off. Okay, the first Global Warming Response Act target required the state to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels or below by 2020. New Jersey has exceeded this goal by more than 20 million metric tons, largely due to the retirement of coal-fired electric generating units and transition to cleaner burning natural gas. The 2050 target establishes a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% from their 2006 levels by 2050. This goal is what we refer to as the 80 by 50 goal, which we estimate is 24.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. As you can see, the 80 by 50 goal will pose significant challenge. In 2018, our latest greenhouse gas inventory, New Jersey's emissions were just below 100 million metric tons. In developing a plan to achieve the emission reductions called for in the Global Warming Response Act, the state embarked in a multifaceted planning process that included multiple stakeholdering sessions that helped inform the emissions and economic modeling process of the Integrated Energy Plan, as well as components of the Energy Master Plan, which described pathways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation, residential commercial heating, and electric generating sectors. The 80 by 50 recommendations report builds on the Energy Master Plan, providing additional details on how to reduce emissions from the energy sectors, but also goes beyond the Energy Master Plan to include emission summaries and various emission reduction strategies from the non-energy sectors, including industrial, waste and agriculture, short-lived climate pollutants, and sequestration. The 80 by 50 report is the third deliverable of a three-phased approach to address climate change mitigation in New Jersey. The report evaluates 7 emission sectors of New Jersey's economy in developing pathways to achieve the 80 by 50 goal. Each sector includes a business as usual that illustrates what happens to emissions under current policies with no additional action. Reduction pathways are also described, and emission reduction estimates are presented for each pathway action. And specific policy recommendations are looked at, and their associated emissions reductions are presented. These recommendations are not the final word, but are meant to highlight the next steps required to begin the transformation in each sector. Here we have New Jersey's 2018 greenhouse gas inventory, which shows that transportation is by far the largest contributor to our greenhouse gas inventory at 42%. Residential, commercial, heating, and electric generation make up the bulk of New Jersey's greenhouse gas emissions. In the report, we evaluated business as usual scenarios for each sector and found that New Jersey is currently not on trajectory to achieve its 80 by 50 goal. Despite the recent actions at the state level, emissions will rebound and actually be higher in 2050 than they are today. This is mostly due to projected increases in short-lived climate pollutants as the result of increased reliance on air conditioning and heat pumps and their associated hydrofluorocarbon emissions. Achieving the 80-50 goal will require a fundamental transformation in the way we generate and consume energy. Each one of us as individuals will need to make a commitment to do things different, to reduce our carbon footprints. Ultimately, there are three critical strategies requiring bold action today. First, replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles. Second, converting space and water heating in residential and commercial building sectors to electric heat. And third, replacing fossil fuels in the electric power generating sector with renewable energy resources. I want to stress that simultaneous development of renewable electric generation is necessary to avoid a shift in emissions to the electric generating sector. If we electrify everything but don't decarbonize electric generation, we will not achieve the 80 by 50 goal. Now I'd like to introduce the Assistant Director of Climate Change and Clean Energy, Bob Ketting, who will go into more detail on the transportation, building, heating, and electric generating sectors. Bob?
Thank you, Paul. And thanks to Rutgers and the New Jersey Climate Resource Center for giving us the opportunity to present the Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report findings. I'm going to go over some of the highlights from the transportation, the residential and commercial building, and the electric generating sectors. Next slide. So transportation accounts for 42% of the emissions in New Jersey in 2018. New Jersey's transportation sector dominates the overall emission profile. Proportionally, this is higher than most other states, but this isn't because New Jersey's transportation sector is larger or more wasteful on a per capita basis. Instead, it's primarily because New Jersey's emissions from its electric generating sector are substantially lower than other states, with nuclear power meeting about 30% of our current electric demand and very, very little coal dispatch as of 2020. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the transportation sector, what we did is we evaluated 5 different pathways for emissions reduction. In doing this, we went somewhat beyond what the Energy Master Plan did, and we looked at VMT, vehicle miles traveled reduction strategies, and the emission impacts of fuel economy standards. Pathway 1 evaluates the EV law and mirrors the strategy outlined in the Energy Master Plan. Pathway 2 evaluates emission reductions from medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Pathway 3 considers the advantages of expanded public transportation. Pathway 4 examined the additional ways to reduce demand for travel. And Pathway 5 looked at the role of what more stringent fuel economy standards could have on the remaining fossil fuel vehicles that are still being used. Next slide, please. Okay, so in doing an analysis of the pathways for emission reduction in transportation, we looked at, and as of As of December of 2019, New Jersey only had about 30,000 electric vehicles registered in the state. And we were averaging about 8,000 new sales per year. So getting the aggressive EV adoption rates in the near term is going to be a challenge. Ultimately, we found that coupling programs that reduce overall demand for transportation with electrification efforts could provide an additional net savings of 115 million metric tons CO2 equivalent over the 30-year period leading up to 2050. And this is just compared to vehicle electrification alone. Implementing transportation measures now results in immediate emission reductions while allowing time for technologies to develop, costs to decrease, and adoption rates to surge. Next slide, please. So the recommendations for transportation. As discussed, electrification of transportation is a key component to meeting the 80 by 50 goal. It will require implementation of legislative and regulatory reforms that facilitate a rapid and a near complete transition away from fossil-powered vehicles, ensuring all new sales of light-duty cars, SUVs, and trucks are electric by 2035. This challenge is great, and achieving it can be bolstered through both the advancement of technology along with critical regional and national collaboration. In order to promote and support this increased adoption of electric vehicles, it is urgent that New Jersey pursue a significant and visible build-out of the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Additionally, public and private sector partnerships will be needed that both assist county and local governments to lead by example by electrifying their fleets, and also to work with industry to develop incentives to electrify medium and heavy-duty vehicle fleets. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through what we refer to in the report as the commercial and residential sector. You can think of it in practical terms as the building sector, so it's commercial and residential buildings. Next slide, please. So residential and commercial emissions, where were we and where are we going? New Jersey's greenhouse gas emissions from the residential sector have varied to some degree over time with a general upward trend. This increase is attributed to the expansion of housing and its associated natural gas consumption. New Jersey added about 140,000 housing units between 2006 and 2018, according to the United States Census Bureau. And they averaged about 12,000 new electric gas service line hookups every year since 2004. Greenhouse gas emissions from the commercial sector have varied over the past 12 years. However, most recently, emissions trended downward from a high of 12.3 million metric tons CO2 equivalent in 2014 to 9.4 million metric tons CO2 equivalent in 2018. Much of this downward trend is attributed to the commercial sector taking advantage of the BPU's clean energy program and energy efficiency incentives and opportunities. It is true that emissions growth in these sectors have been largely held in check due to, as I said, the aggressive energy efficiency efforts and incentives in the clean energy program. And energy efficiency is going to continue to provide a future low-cost energy savings and emissions reductions. However, energy efficiency alone will not be sufficient for us to meet the 80 by 50 goal. Currently, combined residential and commercial sector buildings account for 26% of our statewide greenhouse gas emissions. And as with transportation, we will need to experience a transformation that relies heavily on electricity produced from carbon neutral generation to meet the heating demands of the building sector and achieve the Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 mandate. Next slide. So for the building sector emission reductions pathways that we evaluated, in evaluation, we had two main pathways. Pathway one quantifies the emission benefits of electrification of space and water heating and other appliances which currently use oil, propane, or natural gas. Pathway two evaluates the role of energy efficiency in minimizing emissions. Energy efficiency improvements are firmly established and are among the most cost-effective strategies, as I previously mentioned, for avoiding reducing fossil fuel consumption and resulting greenhouse gas emissions. So New Jersey has already taken steps to encourage EE, and more recently through the Clean Energy Act, it requires utilities to implement additional energy efficiency measures that will reduce natural gas consumption by at least 0.75% per year. Next slide. Okay, so the emission reductions analysis from the building sector, collectively, those two pathways, pathway 1 and 2, will potentially eliminate about 21.9 million metric tons CO2 equivalent from the building sector by 2050, or that's about 89% of where we are now. These graphs show the relative contributions of electrifying propane, oil, and natural gas, and the additional reductions associated with natural gas and energy efficiency. While moving away from natural gas applications will provide the largest emissions reduction in this sector, conversion of propane and oil to electric may provide opportunity for early adoption and has the co-benefit of reducing local criteria pollutant emissions. Next slide. So the recommendations from the building sector. Achieving the 80 by 50 goal will be a multi-decade process of eliminating fossil fuel use in the building sector through large-scale electrification, while, as we had mentioned before, it's critical to simultaneously ensuring that electricity is produced by clean energy sources. The state is just embarking on this effort and will need to develop a roadmap to guide this effort. The state will need to consider adopting new building codes to ensure electrification of new construction, as every building built today relying on natural gas will become a stranded asset. Further, the state could consider appliance standards, phasing out fossil fuel appliances also by a certain date. Next slide, please. So the electric generation chapter. Next slide. So where we are, again, where we were, where we are now, and where we're going in the electric generation emissions. Currently, electric generation accounts for 19% of the New Jersey's economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions. The Energy Master Plan and the 80 by 50 report both assume New Jersey will achieve zero net carbon emissions from electric generation by 2050. This decarbonization of electric generation must be achieved at the same time with a more than doubling of the demand. The increase in demand is due to the massive electrification of transportation and the building sector. Next slide, please. So emission reduction pathways that we evaluated in the electric generating sector. We evaluated 3 pathways that work together to achieve the state's emission reduction goal. Pathway 1 evaluates the role of demand-based incentives such as energy efficiency. Pathway 2 considers the growing in-state renewables such as offshore wind, solar, PV, and opportunity for renewable biofuels. Pathway 3 evaluates the gap between the demand and in-state generation, illustrating the need for importing out-of-state renewable energy. Ultimately, all 3 of these goals will have to work together to achieve the 80 by 50 goal. Next slide. So an analysis of the emission reduction pathways we did in this chapter, we evaluated a number of different demand scenarios, which are referred to as reference cases in the report. For the purpose of today, I'm going to focus on reference case D. That's the dark blue line at the top of the graph. This reference case assumes a more than doubling of the electric demand over the next 30 years from electrification of transportation in the building sector, without a reciprocal build out of the state renewable energy. So we're assuming we're going to double, but we are not going to have the corresponding increase in the available renewable energy sources or procurement of the out-of-state renewable energy sources. So if we do this, at first, the emissions in this scenario are held in check And that's largely due to the mandates of the Clean Energy Act happening between now and 2030, and also the deployment of 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind, which will be added through 2035. But thereafter, that emissions will rise dramatically and reach an upward of 36 million metric tons by 2050, nearly twice the rate of 2020. So this illustrates why it is imperative that electrification of other sectors is preceded by a comparable expansion of renewable resources, or else emissions will merely shift from one sector to another. To achieve the 80 by 50 goal, New Jersey must build a vast renewable energy system that will meet future demand. The table on this slide shows the needed in-state installed capacity for renewable electric generation. And this is based on the EMP, the Energy Master Plan modeling of the least cost pathway to achieve the 80 by 50 and the 100% carbon neutral electric generation by 2050. Next slide, please. So recommendations moving forward for the electric generating sector. Recommendations to accomplish the decarbonization of electric generation include the timely creation of a successor solar incentive program, creation of a large-scale grid supply solar program, also to consider legislation that would create a dedicated office of renewable siting. Considering New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the nation, and there's, but certainly green space and open space is a commodity and a priority to preserve it. We definitely want smart siting of renewable energy sources. Consider legislation requiring solar PV on new construction, and also implement regulatory limitations on CO2 emissions. All this has to be done with, keeping an eye on that, considering New Jersey is a PJM state, and we rely on the PJM regional transmission operator to manage the electricity dispatch market. Regional collaborations with other PJM states on clean energy policy will play a very important role in meeting our electric decarbonization goals. The success of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, is an example of how collaboration among states with similar greenhouse gas reduction goals can help drive change. I'm going to hand it off now to Helaine Barr, who will cover the remaining sectors. Helaine is a research scientist in the Bureau of Climate Change, and she was instrumental in managing the writing of the 80 by 50 report, and led the effort to format and complete this report's final application. So thank Helaine for efforts in this, and I turn it over to her.
Thank you, Bob. And I just want to say thank you to Rucker and everybody listening today. I will be providing a really short overview of the remaining sectors of the report. So the industrial sector, waste and agriculture, short-lived climate pollutants, and carbon sequestration. So jumping right in, industrial emissions account for about 7% of greenhouse gas emissions in New Jersey. Industry is tough. It's considered one of the hardest to abate emission sectors because industrial processes vary immensely and are technically difficult to decarbonize. There are really few scalable methods that exist for generating large quantities of high temperature heat other than burning fossil fuels and using processed gases, both of which are emission intensive. Several industrial processes generate emissions directly, such as manufacturing ammonia and cement, and other processes such as refining are highly integrative, so much so that changing a single step in the process requires other steps to be modified, usually at great cost. Therefore, since this is like a pretty technically hard sector to reduce emissions from, we've only really evaluated one pathway here. And this pathway assesses the emissions impact of the Clean Energy Act energy efficiency mandates that were passed recently. Emission reductions were calculated based on achieving the Clean Energy Act 0.75% reduction in natural gas. Overall, the DEP estimates that this pathway could achieve up to 500,000 metric ton reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. So I would like to note that this is a conservative estimate, as the EPU has already established a more ambitious energy efficiency target of 1.1% for gas distribution companies. And further, Petroleum refineries are the largest source of industrial emissions in this sector in terms of both methane and CO2, accounting for about 4 million metric tons annually. So while there is generally limited opportunity to reduce direct emissions from the state's refineries, we can anticipate that significant reductions would be realized with the economy-wide transition away from fossil fuel use that is envisioned in the 2019 EMP. Ultimately, our recommendations here focus on incentivizing energy efficiency work in industrial facilities. Energy efficiency is not only beneficial for the environment, but it can provide significant operational savings and improve profitability. Increasing awareness around BPU's clean energy programs and developing new financing mechanisms such as a green bank and on-bill financing can help propel the adoption of energy efficiency measures. Further, we recommend expanding the Clean Energy Act requirement for benchmarking energy use to industrial facilities in the state. Benchmarking makes owners and operators more aware of their energy use and other inputs, priming them for future efficiency investments. Next up is waste and agriculture. Combined, these sectors account for about 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state, and unfortunately, if action isn't taken, emission from the waste sector will rise. Activities that contribute to greenhouse gases from these sectors include the decomposition of food waste in landfills, venting and flaring of landfill gas and digester gas. And agricultural practices also contribute a small amount to New Jersey's greenhouse gas emissions at less than 0.5%. Enteric fermentation or digestion of food and ruminant animals such as cattle and animal waste are the leading sources of methane from these activities. New Jersey's agriculture sector also generates nitrous oxide and small amounts of CO2 from the use of nitrogen fertilizers and soils and the burning of crop residue. Within this chapter, we evaluated 3 different pathways. Pathway 1 focused on reducing and recovering food waste and evaluates a variety of strategies to limit landfill emissions, primarily by diverting food waste from entering the waste stream. Pathway 2 looks at how best to optimize energy recovery in wastewater treatment facilities and then examines biomass to energy projects. Specifically, there's potential to co-digest wastewater biosolids with food waste or animal manure to provide beneficial energy production. By adding these wastes into the wastewater treatment process, it helps to increase the BTU content of the gas. Currently, New Jersey has about 19 wastewater treatment facilities that flare gas. This gas could be captured and utilized for energy production. Further, New Jersey will rely on biogas near the midterm and near the mid-century to meet its decarbonization goals. Utilizing local waste to the greatest extent possible would provide the most sustainable path to attaining a biogas supply. Finally, Pathway 3 evaluates better agricultural practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, we did have some data limitations and we were not able to calculate the precise emission reductions associated with all 3 pathways. But we were able to evaluate the efficacy of Pathway 1, and we found that reducing current food waste disposal in landfills by 50% by 2030 could eliminate close to 2 million metric tons annually by 2050. However, achieving this scale of food waste reduction and recovery by 2030 will require everyone from residents, businesses, and other entities to generate less food waste, as well as the creation of a food waste recycling industry in New Jersey. This pathway alone can reduce about 30% of the emissions in this sector. Preliminary efforts should focus on developing a regulatory driver that requires food waste reduction and recovery. This will directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provide a feedstock for the generation of renewable biogas. The DEP should continue its work to promote food waste reduction, finalize the food waste reduction plan, and embark on related rule development as necessary. Further, we feel that the state should create guidelines and recommendations for county siting and streamline permitting for food waste recycling facilities. And community efforts to source separate organic waste should also be encouraged. The agricultural community should also be encouraged to utilize incentivize precision agriculture, which would limit their inputs, and therefore reduce greenhouse gases as well. Okay, now jumping to short-lived climate pollutants. This chapter is actually split into 3 different topic areas, looking at methane, halogenated gases, and black carbon. The biggest methane sources in New Jersey come from in-state and out-of-state landfills and leaks from natural gas transmission and distribution system. I've already talked a bit about the methane and the waste piece, so this next chapter will focus on methane from natural gas. Halogenated gases are the next largest source of SLCPs, as we call them, and are associated with hydrofluorocarbons used in air conditioning, refrigeration, and heat pumps. And finally, black carbon or soot is an aerosol component of particulate matter. It's not actually gas. It's formed through the incomplete combustion of fossil fuels and from biomass burning. So SLCPs do have greater impacts on climate change in the near term, often remaining in the atmosphere for less time, from a few days to a few decades. In contrast, carbon dioxide can last centuries. Currently, SLCPs count for about 15% of the state's total climate pollutant emissions. And as you can see from the pie chart, carbon dioxide is the primary contributor and will be the primary challenge to achieving New Jersey's 80 by 50 goal. So 3% of greenhouse gas emissions in the state occur from natural gas transmission and distribution systems. Of that, 50% of those emissions are related to the distribution service lines. Much of New Jersey's natural gas infrastructure was installed prior to the 1950s. And these older pipelines are typically made of cast iron and unprotected steel, which are more likely to leak than newer protected steel and durable plastics, which have been phased in more recently. In fact, New Jersey has a whopping 17% of the total remaining inventory of cast iron pipelines in the country, more than any other state. We evaluated 3 different pathways here. The first one looked at pipeline replacement, specifically phasing out all cast iron and unprotected steel pipelines. Currently, the utilities do periodically submit modernization plans to replace these failing materials. So this pathway considers the current rate of replacement and projects replacing all older materials into the future. Pathway 2 considers the use of cutting-edge leak detection and quantification methods, which can help utilities pinpoint and prioritize leaks. This method has been proven. PSE&G has demonstrated its viability through its partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, where they utilized methane mapping to inform their capital improvement priorities and achieved greater methane reductions through that effort. And last but not least, Pathway 3 evaluates the use of non-pipeline solutions to fully eliminate the need for pipeline expansion in the state. Rather than building new pipelines, utilities are encouraged to find alternative solutions such as targeted energy efficiency, beneficial electrification, and net zero energy buildings. On average, between 2004 and 2019, New Jersey added over 216 miles of distribution mains and over 12,000 service lines. By transitioning to non-pipeline solutions, the state can avoid the build out of new natural gas infrastructure that would ultimately become stranded assets as the state transitions to electrification. So there were some data limitations here again, so we weren't able to calculate precise emission reductions from all 3 pathways. But we found that pathway 1, modernizing natural gas infrastructure, could provide up to a 0.6 reduction in greenhouse gases by 2042. Accelerating replacement schedules would realize these savings sooner, but costs can be a challenge. Main replacement programs can cost between $1 to $5 million per mile to replace pipes. In urban areas, which New Jersey has a lot of, often have these large inventory of cast iron and unprotected steel pipe and face higher costs due to the congestion, the multiple underground utilities, and limited construction seasons due to weather. But by transitioning to non-pipeline solutions, the state could avoid future emissions of about 0.3 million metric tons. And when these pathways are combined, emissions would drop below 2 million metric tons by 2050. Ultimately, reducing New Jersey's methane leak rate will require a collaboration between industry and government. The local distribution companies already have approved active pipeline replacement programs to upgrade infrastructure. In the near term, the BPU should continue to pursue ambitious replacement schedules for cast iron and unprotected steel pipes, mitigating the leakiest pipeline materials. But there are other state models that exist that New Jersey could emulate to further bolster this effort. For example, some states have set specific targets, either in terms of miles of pipeline to replace each year or as a deadline for completing targeted replacement. For instance, Massachusetts requires companies to completely replace their cast iron and unprotected steel within 20 years, or justify an example, and New Jersey could learn lessons from these types of state actions. Halogenated gases. These account for about 5% of greenhouse gas emissions in New Jersey, but they are the fastest growing source of greenhouse gases in the state and globally. This is due to the prevalent use of HFCs in air conditioning, heat pumps, and refrigerants as a replacement for ozone-depleting substances, which were phased out under the Montreal Protocol. Without action, emissions from HFCs will spike to over 13 million metric tons in 2050 in New Jersey. At best, we're hoping to hold the emissions flat by transitioning to low global warming potential alternatives. As New Jersey, we'll see a marked increase in the use of HFC as it electrifies its building sectors, primarily through the use of heat pumps. Given the lifespan of heat pumps and air conditioning equipment, simultaneously phasing out high global warming potential HFC refrigerant use is critical. Two pathways were considered here. The first one are containment strategies, which are often very effective in reducing HFC emissions in the short run. One-time emissions from disposal, if unabated, can be just as large as the annual emissions from using high global warming potential HFCs in making equipment. And pathway 2 evaluates emission reductions associated with phasing out and banning products. Fortunately, New Jersey has already passed legislation to tackle HFCs. The 2019 legislation prohibits the use of the highest global warming potential HFCs and other similar substances and all new equipment or products for sale. So there is a way forward here for the state. To evaluate emissions reductions associated with these efforts, DEP utilized the United States Climate Alliance emissions tool to compare various policy-based scenarios. So this tool evaluates the impact of both state and federal action. The items circled in the legend are those considered state action and align with pathway 1 and pathway 2. When combined, the state would be able to hold emissions flat out to 2030. But without taking action, emissions will rise to close to 7 million metric tons. However, there is promise of the federal government also taking action in the near term, which would enable deeper reductions in emissions to occur. As you can see, if the federal government does adopt SNAP rules and takes part in the Valley, emissions could drop to close to 3 million metric tons by 2030. So there is ample opportunity to avoid these emissions. The state will need to implement its existing laws to phase down HFCs and implement training and licensing programs. Additionally, the state in the near future is going to need to update its building codes to support the selection of low global warming substitutes in appliances and equipment. All right, so black carbon. So this is the last SLCP I'll be talking about. Black carbon, as I mentioned before, is not a greenhouse gas. So technically it's not part of the inventory, but if included, it would have accounted for about 3% of emissions. These emissions are primarily from fossil fuel sources, such as on-road and off-road vehicles, industrial processing, waste disposal, and energy and power generation. Black carbon is not a significant contributor to New Jersey's climate pollutant inventory, and black carbon from stationary sources even less so. However, black carbon compromises local air quality, and black carbon resulting from diesel combustion is a known carcinogen. So reducing black carbon has benefits beyond those associated just with climate protection. 3 pathways have been identified for how the state could reduce black carbon. Pathway 1 is a continued commitment to the existing control technologies. This evaluates several control technologies that have proven successful in reducing black carbon emissions from mobile sources. These include the federal and California emission standards for new engines, with emission reductions occurring as the fleets turn over. All on-road diesel vehicles are required to use ultra-low sulfur diesel, and all-road diesel engines built since 2007 are equipped with diesel particulate filters. Pathway 2 considers the EMP's transportation electrification strategy and examines how these mandates will impact black carbon emissions. And pathway 3 considers other methods to pursue black carbon reduction in non-road diesel equipment. Diesel engines employed in non-road equipment like bulldozers and cranes have historically not been held to the same emission standards as similar engines used in on-road vehicles such as trucks. It was not until 2010 that emission standards began to align. However, these are slower to realize because this equipment often has a much longer lifetime and has a much slower fleet turnover rate. Currently, there is no regulatory driver requiring the replacement of these older diesel engines with cleaner Tier 4 engine technology and non-road sources. However, the DEP is exploring this as part of its upcoming New Jersey PAC rule development, so there is hope. Looking at the emissions analysis, New Jersey could realize a 47% reduction in black carbon emissions from on-road and non-road equipment through 2030, just with a commitment to its existing control technologies. DEP extrapolated these rates through 2050, calculating that New Jersey could achieve up to a 1.2 million metric ton reduction. And this would occur largely through the replacement of medium and heavy-duty vehicles with cleaner Tier 4 compliant diesel engines. Pathway 2, the adoption of electric vehicles, will provide the same level of black carbon reductions as switching to cleaner Tier 4 diesel engines, but also has the added benefit of providing CO2 reductions and other co-benefits. In the near term, New Jersey should continue to oppose any federal rollback of emission standards to ensure no backsliding in the adoption of cleaner diesel engines. And further, the state should work to implement the electrification recommendations as outlined in this report and the Energy Master Plan, which will reduce both black carbon and CO2. And finally, there are a variety of regulatory mechanisms that can be adopted to quicken reductions. Specifically, a variety of black carbon regulations are actively being explored under the NJPAC rule development. The last but not least is carbon sequestration. So this chapter is slightly different. This is really looking at carbon gain and a way to sequester and take the carbon out of our atmosphere here in New Jersey. Natural carbon sinks, such as forests, woodlands, and agricultural lands and wetlands, help to offset about 8% of New Jersey's emissions. Looking forward to 2030 and 2050, the DEP projects a modest increase in the total sequestration levels to about 8.6 million metric tons by 2030 and upwards to 9.5 million metric tons if there's no significant changes in recent land use and a decline in land clearing. However, these projections don't take into account some of the impacts of climate change, specifically sea level rise. So I think that there's a strong possibility that sequestration could decrease in the future. Further, the state continues to make land use decisions that reduces the valuable acreage of its carbon sinks. Between 1986 and 2015, New Jersey lost over 360,000 acres to development, losing agricultural lands, wetlands, and forests, and continued development of these resources will reduce the state's existing carbon sinks without a doubt. So within this chapter, we evaluated 5 preliminary pathways for maintaining and increasing carbon sequestration in the state. The first one looks at reforestation on pasture and cropland, wetlands, and other lands. The second pathway evaluates additional carbon storage that would be retained by eliminating forest loss and grassland loss. Pathway 3 considers the role of blue carbon. Blue carbon refers to organic carbon that is captured and stored by oceans and coastal ecosystems, including seagrass meadows and tidal marshes. New Jersey has an estimated 191,000 acres of blue carbon resources that can help offset emissions. Pathway 4 evaluates carbon gain potential from the use of cover cropping and cropland nutrient management. And the last pathway 5 considers the role of forest management in protecting and enhancing New Jersey's existing forests. Again, New Jersey's existing forests are going to be at risk from several effects of climate change, including wildfire, invasive species, pests, diseases, and inundation. New Jersey's pineland forests are particularly vulnerable to becoming net emitters due to their increased density, which leaves them more vulnerable to pest species such as the southern pine beetle. So these estimates, again, were developed by the U.S. Climate Alliance on behalf of New Jersey, and they utilize a variety of methods to assess carbon gain by land type. These are very much preliminary evaluations, and I think there's a lot more work here that the state could do. And as you can see, some of the ones with the stars on them, don't represent a full accounting. But preliminary evaluations indicate that these pathways could provide anywhere between 2 to 3 million metric tons of CO2 per year in additional carbon sequestration, with reforestation representing the biggest opportunity for carbon gains in the state. So within the report, there's about 30 different discrete recommendations within this chapter. I just pulled out some of the ones that I thought were most important. So first off, the state needs to develop a carbon sequestration plan and establish statewide carbon sequestration targets for 2030 and 2050 to ensure that, we're working towards increasing and protecting our existing sinks. Additionally, about 30% of the forest land in New Jersey is owned by families, individuals, trusts, and estates, with the majority of the owners over the age of 45. So it will really be imperative to work closely with these individuals and the next generation of owners to protect and manage these natural resources. One idea proposed in this report is to create a privately owned woodland conservation program that could purchase easements or incentives for property owners to maintain their properties and reforest them. This would address a critical gap in current land preservation policies that currently only incentivize easements on active farmland or require public access to them. With that, that is the conclusion of the sector analysis. In summary again, how's it going and where we need to be? Achieving the state's 80 by 50 goal is really going to require action from every single sector of New Jersey. It's not just enough to decarbonize our grid or transition to electric vehicles. We're going to need a patchwork of actions, from reducing our food waste to protecting our carbon sinks and switching to low global warming potential heating and cooling equipment. And if these actions aren't taken, our emissions will be higher than they are today. So this report really is a call to action for all levels of government, economic sectors, communities, and individuals. It will require sustained public support for climate measures and for each and every one of us to make more sustainable choices. So what can you as a resident of New Jersey do? Well, first off, there's over 8 million New Jersey residents. There's only a handful of you listening in today. So can you be a climate ambassador, engage your community, family, and friends to all these issues, and help them understand why this stuff is important and some of the big policies that are going to be coming down the pike need their support. Next, I would say, consider making your next car purchase an EV. Consider purchasing electric appliances when it's time to upgrade, specifically heat pumps if you're in a natural gas or using propane or oil heat. Look at using electric stoves or thermal water heaters, and consider ways that you can reduce your energy demand at home, especially now with many of us working from home. It would be a great time to utilize some of the great residential incentives the Board of Public Utilities has. You could get a home energy audit, think about ways to better insulate, and strategize any remodeling you do to improve your efficiency. Also, this is a great time to consider rooftop solar and battery storage technologies. As Bob discussed and Paul, we're going to need to see a monumental increase in the renewable energy cited in the state. If you have the ability and resources to do that, it'd be gladly welcome. All right, and so at that, I'm going to hand it back over to Marjorie. Thank you.
Thank you, Helaine. I really want to thank you and Bob and Paul for such a great presentation. I'd like to invite Bob and Paul to unmute their microphones and join you on camera for the Q&A. And I'm going to turn it over and invite my friend, Dr. Carrie Ferraro, who's been diligently monitoring the chat, and she will direct all these questions in this very, very busy chat box to you all. So Carrie, take it away.
Thanks, Marjorie, and it was very busy. So thank you all for your questions, and a very special thank you to you, Helaine, Paul, and Paul and Bob for such wonderful presentations. So we received a number of questions about incentives to reach the 80-50 goal. Nadine Sapperman states that there's broad support from economists for a carbon tax, a revenue-neutral carbon tax that it returns revenue to households in the form of a monthly dividend would jumpstart our clean energy economy without negatively impacting people with low or moderate incomes. She asks, how do today's experts see a price on carbon as a measure to help New Jersey achieve its goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And anybody who wants to jump in on that one, feel free to do so.
I'll start, and then Bob and Helaine, feel free to jump in. Thank you for that question. Carbon pricing is a big discussion, both at the state, at the region, and at the national level. With the change in federal leadership, I think that you're going to hear more about that on a national scope. It's important to remember that New Jersey, Bob touched on it, but I don't know, our electric, we are a competitive market that participates in the PJM regional dispatch market. So any carbon pricing that states do, like we already have with the RGGI program, any additional carbon pricing would have to be incorporated into the PJM market construct. So, and those discussions are actually happening at the PJM level with states are engaging in that conversation.
That's great. I think that's Bob does.
No, I just concur with what I said. The importance of a carbon pricing. I think that looking at RGGI as an example, which effectively is carbon pricing within the electric generating sector, it shows that how the opportunity exists. But I think it also illustrates that a collaboration and a broad region to incorporate a carbon price ultimately would result in a more competitive, transparent, and more efficient market. We continue to move the ball forward for internalizing the cost of carbon in the things that we do. Also recognizing that there is certain limitations, market limitations of an individual state going it alone in that policy.
Great. Thank you all so much. So along the lines of the last question, we received, in addition to some of the great recommendations that you presented, we received a lot of recommendations for reducing greenhouse emissions from the participants in the chat box. We'll share these with you, but is there a way for folks to also share some recommendations for consideration with the state?
Yeah, I mean, we have a, if they want to email us, we do have a at dep.nj.gov, recommendations via email. And we are planning on revising this report, periodically in the upcoming years as new technologies and things come online and there's new pathways out there. So, we always look forward to the feedback from the public and hearing your thoughts on this stuff.
Thank you so much. So this next question is for Bob, and it comes from Mike Alcott. Mike says that the growth of the gigawatt growth of biogas, biofuels, and hydrogen from 0.3 GW in 2045 to 17.6 gigawatts in 2050 seems extremely challenging. How is there a plan for how this might be achieved in 5 years?
Thanks, Mike. So that build out of renewable biogas to supply electric generation, that was a output of the modeling that we did with the public utilities and led by the Rocky Mountain Institute to how we would get to meet the 80 by 50 goal and also achieve 100% carbon net neutral electric generation in 2050. So the biggest challenge in doing that is you're in running this model, you're dealing with 2020 economics and 2020 technology. So what the model is selecting biogas, therefore, is that as you get closer to 2050 and you have the constraint on the model to have 100% carbon neutral electric generation by 2050, you start running into it's a tremendously it's a large cost to meet the resiliency needs for electric dispatch with the renewables. So we have this massive build out of offshore wind, massive build out of solar in state, and we have this corresponding build out of out of state solar and wind. But what you get is those are not dispatchable. The grid can't call upon them to dispatch to meet really high demand days and to meet the federally mandated capacity resiliency requirements. So admittedly, that biogas, well, it was based on the available sustainable biomass from the, I think it was the 2016 DOE study for the billion ton report it was referred to as. So that holding in place now, we're acknowledging you need to have dispatchable electricity, and that could be produced by a commitment to sustainable biogas, but acknowledging we're talking 2045 and looking at 2020 technology. That could also be met by increased technology of battery storage to allow for dispatchable generation at a really large scale, or other renewables coming online. So yeah, appreciate the question. That would be tremendously a big challenge with today's technology. And look at it as somewhat as acknowledging the need to meet our resiliency requirements, and somewhat of a placeholder based on the technology we have today.
Great answer. Thank you so much. Okay, so our next question is again, kind of going back to incentives a little bit. Rob Graff asks, why do you think the availability of public charging infrastructure is a larger barrier to electric vehicle uptake than vehicle cost? Has analysis been done comparing the effectiveness of electric vehicle, can't say it, of investing in vehicle rebates to investing in charging infrastructure? Sorry, I'll repeat that. Has an analysis been done comparing the effectiveness of EV uptake of investing in vehicle rebates to investing in charging infrastructure? And I'll open that one to.
Yeah, I'll start, and Helaine and Bob, please jump in. I think the concern is that where we see a barrier to electric vehicle charging infrastructure is really local building codes and municipalities struggles that they have the desire to want to provide these incentives and these devices, for the public's use. But building codes in some areas tend to be a barrier to that. Also, just building logistics becomes another barrier to the infrastructure. But there are a lot of studies and a lot of groups, not just DEP, EDA, NBPU, and DCA are all looking at this issue because it is a key component to reaching the emission reductions that we show have to be made in the transportation sector. And so we realize that the infrastructure to support electric vehicles is paramount to its success. And for those in multi-family dwellings, they are working on getting past those hurdles.
Thank you so much, Paul. So again, coming back to the electric vehicles, so how are you encouraging change in land use to impact the transportation sector, which even if it is all electric, will still result in wear and tear on roadways?
Elaine, do you want that one? You want me to take it? No, I'll start. We have looked at the transit village designs and stuff like that. New Jersey is a densely populated state. And every county has significant population, but to the effect where we've seen success, we're trying to model that and to mimic that and copy that as best we can. And as Helaine pointed out in the conclusion, if we're going to see the kind of transformation we're talking about, and it's huge, lifestyle as we know it today is going to look different. And I think nothing more than COVID has put front and center that lifestyles that we think we can't change or don't have the ability to change, when faced with an obstacle like COVID, we've made adjustments, some better than others. And, I think you're just going to see a continuation of this. And I think, as, the snowball starts to roll, we're starting to see that momentum. Even a year ago, some of the things that we included in the report, I had a hard time envisioning myself. And now I'm seeing, utilities acknowledging that they have to decarbonize and the steps they're taking to do so. And every sector is doing this. And you wouldn't have expected this even a year ago, that this wasn't even a conversation. So it's hard to envision, every part of this, but I will say that I do see, I'm so happy to get this report out so we can put, the spike in the sand that shows where are we in New Jersey. There's been a lot of discussion, with, in every, both through government, through environmental organizations and the public with what we think we should be focusing on. This just at least puts a clearer sight on where we are at today and where do we need to focus. And this is really the starting point. This report will start the groundswell of getting troops out to do the work that needs to be done in every area. It's going to touch every part of our lives.
Yeah, and I would say one of the interesting things too in the report that we sort of dived into, which we didn't anticipate, when we first started drafting it, was work from home and how that can help reduce emissions in the long term. And within the transportation chapter, that is one of the pathways that we evaluated. And in 2019, only about 5% of New Jersey's population worked from home 3 or more days a week. But according to some studies, about 30% of jobs then could have been performed from home. So it'll be interesting to see as the future unfolds, how many of us will continue to work from home and how that could impact our emissions and reduce our need to be on those roadways, utilizing cars, and maybe folks own less cars or opt for public transportation more. And I think ultimately it's going to be a combination of all those strategies that are going to get us to 80 by 50. And again, the future holds a lot of unknowns here, right? This whole report is like trying to, get a needle in a haystack about how we're going to get to 2050, but things will change and evolve. And our conversation here is just the starting point, like Paul said. So in the future, you will revise this and have, as we get closer to that end date, closer to how it's going to actually be fulfilled.
Thank you both so much. So not to beat a dead horse, but another question about the emissions data and transportation. We received a couple of similar questions about the way the data is presented, in that whether it's possible to split the transportation greenhouse gas emissions to show the percentage from residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, to show separately, to show the consumers that they also have a responsibility to reduce emissions, and whether that this would be something that's possible or not.
Well, I know that our Bureau of Mobile Sources is, they're looking at transportation in every aspect, including the commercial, including the ports, including, public transportation, along with New Jersey Transit and others. And so to present, this report you can see is pretty voluminous to begin with. It's over 200 pages. And we were trying to tell a simple story here with the details to be further, vetted. So I do think that you're probably seeing that already in strategies to attack different sectors, and how much of that becomes public facing, obviously, as we move forward. Any legislation, any regulation, even any initiative, we're going to put the reasons why we're doing it. So I'm sure there'll be a public piece to it at that point.
Thank you. Okay, so Bob, we had another question for you. Michael Winka asked, doesn't battery storage help in the dispatch of intermittent solar and OSW resources within NJ and PJM? Excuse me.
Yes, and thanks, Mike. And that that speaks to where we are today with current technology and moving forward. Batteries. We just see it in our own lives that the battery technology is developing, and we just get a lot more power and a lot more long lasting out of the the consumer batteries we use. The key thing for using battery as storage for then dispatchable electricity is one component is if you have excess renewable electric generation. You're not going to use it of the grid at that time, right? You can store it. That's a win-win. If you're going to essentially store the electricity rather than using it from a distributed capacity on site or supplying to the grid, you run into the battery efficiency, and you need to be able to essentially when you dispatch that charged electricity from the battery, you have to offset emissions. You have to get a net reduction. In other words, the benefit of storing it when you dispatch it results in a net reduction, rather than if you just would have sent it to the grid in the first place. You may have achieved greater emission reductions. But As we move forward, the biggest challenge is going to be to get a large scale battery storage that can dispatch for the amount of hours necessary that the regional transmission operator would be mandated to provide energy to serve as that backup. So right now it's challenging because you have to put, a large amount of batteries to deliver that amount of, store that amount of electricity to dispatch to provide that level of like grid resiliency or peaking power. But, again, we're talking with 2020 technology, and, we all anticipate that battery storage, not only for distributed energy use, but to cut off our really peak demand periods and keep those dirtiest load following or peaking units offline is going to play a key component as we move towards 2050.
Thank you so much. So we had a few questions that were related to how the state plan, related to how the state plan it will be assisting local governments and commercial industries in aligning with this emission reduction plan. So some participants asked for a little bit of clarification. For example, Kathleen Foley asked, how is waste measured? She's assuming it's not the trucks just picking up and delivering the waste to the landfills.
Maybe a little further clarification on the question, if you can repeat that. Or Helaine, are you catching the nuance? I'm not sure I caught the nuance of her question.
Yeah, is it the question of how the weight, like the emissions from waste? I mean, we use the EPA state inventory tool to calculate emissions. I don't actually specifically know the inputs of that myself. I do think that we look at the pounds of waste, and then we have sort of, emission factors that are associated with that.
Yes, that's absolutely the question. Thanks, Helaine. Also, so there was, I guess you answered this before. There was a question about kind of the transportation sector, and Paul, I think you addressed this for the most part, but there was a question about whether Newark Airport is also included in this sector, and whether they are part of the carbon reduction equation.
And yes, now depending, we do not have any jurisdiction as a state over air traffic and the emissions from the airplanes themselves, but for the ground equipment, the support equipment, that is in this report, and that is part of our strategies for reducing, both pollution in environmental justice communities that surround those ports, but also looking at, the black carbon reductions too that also impact the local communities. So that part of the emissions from the airports are incorporated into the report and into the strategies to address reductions.
Carrie, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, thank you. And so I guess for our last question, there was a question about where folks can find the greenhouse gas inventory.
Helaine, you know this by heart.
Yes,
It's on our
website.
website.
You can go to NJDEP climate change. So I think it's nj.gov/DEP/climate change. And then under New Jersey climate data, we have a page on the inventories.
Helaine, we'd love it if you just typed it in the chat box for everyone. That'd be great to send it to everyone. And then on behalf of all of us here at the Climate Change Resource Center, we'd like to once again thank Paul Orlando, Bob Ketting, and Helaine Barr for not only their fantastic presentations, but for their service to New Jersey in preparing this plan. So thank you all. And yes, this webinar is recorded. We'll hope everyone will join us for our next Climate Academy. It'll be December 14th at 12 noon. We'll be joined by Mark Lowry, colleague from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation's Office of Climate Change, and Barbara Kendall of the New York Department of State's Office of Planning, Development, and Community Infrastructure for a primer on new guidance and standards for flood risk management, infrastructure siting, and design guidelines and model local laws under New York's Community Risk and Resilience Act. So that concludes today's event, and thank you all.